Today we will talk about two aspects, that is multilingualism and scholastic achievements. In a way, we will be talking about why multilingualism is more effective for scholastic achievements. This is an important aspect to look at in the larger domain of understanding relationship between language and society. We have been making an attempt to understand and underline the complexities of relationship between the two, that is language and society. We have first looked at language and then looked at society, and we have tried to combine, add and deduct and see how things are helpful in understanding the complexity and how and what comes out of this complexity, which helps us understanding the two terms in a better way. In the same order, we will be looking at this aspect today. We want to begin with certain introductory ideas that we have been dealing with and that we want to move with. We have tried to understand multilingualism. Multilingualism in a way defines language. What we have said and established in no ambiguous term that multilingualism is equivalent to language. It is synonymous with language. Such an idea has got implications, and subsequent implications of this idea has huge bearing on how everything happens with the help of education. We have established that language can only be defined as multilingualism because language is really a combination of many languages within. We give it a name, or we still talk about internal varieties of a language, but it has a huge amount of things inside the umbrella called language. It's viable, it's maintainable at the level of sounds, words, sentences, uses, discourse and all kinds of domains in which we use language substantiate the fact. We have looked at how language is looked at in the domain of education. Education, as we discussed, happens to be one of the most significant domains of language use in society. It's a very wide domain because that domain touches every single individual of every single society. We may have thousands of societies on this earth. Some domains may be relevant for few societies and some are not relevant for some societies. However, the domain of education cuts across all societies that we know of. Such is the significance of this domain of education, and we looked at how language works in that domain in the society. What we found in terms of understanding schools, language in schools, language in education and language of education was actually what works is multilingualism and not the idea of a language, because to begin with the idea of a language does not exist. The idea of a language, since it does not exist, therefore cannot be viable for education, cannot be a maintainable idea. In our discussions with English of India, and we want to put it this way because we have argued why it should be called English of India, because English spoken in India is not merely just a variety of English spoken in other parts of the world, but it has acquired its own social, linguistic and ethnic identity within societies of India. Therefore, in the complex linguistic ecology of this subcontinent, English must be recognized as one of the languages of this subcontinent, which may be to some extent similar to similar languages spoken in other parts of the world. So, with the example of English that is spoken in India, we have seen how it is several languages within, particularly at the level of sounds. If we want to examine, we can clearly identify the first language of the speaker of English. For example, speakers of English who have Tamil as the first language would have more features of Tamil at the level of sounds definitely, and also at the level of sentences in their English. The Hindi speakers, Bangla speakers and the speakers of any other language, for example, when speak English, will have huge impact of phonology, morphology and syntax of their first language in English. That is not just an impact, that has converted the language English into something else which has merged with the identity of the speakers of English with the first language of that speaker. Therefore, the language does not remain one, and it becomes many within one, and therefore, that helps us understand that the idea of a language for the purpose of education does not fit into how language works in the society. It does not help us understand society very well in the real terms, real picture of society, how it works. And on the other hand, we have looked at the same idea from a different perspective, that this idea does not exist to begin with. Such a thing cannot be artificially pushed into such a significant domain of education. And this has also helped us understand that the distinction between standard and non-standard, and the understanding of the term native speakers have to be revisited in such contexts. And then we understand how language works, and as we discussed a minute before, that we are going to be looking at how language plays a role in our scholastic achievements, which is largely related to schools, but intersects other domains of the language use in the society as well. So, we are going to be looking at language with the perspective of its definition as multilingualism, and then we are going to see how it relates and how it affects scholastic achievements. There are two parts when we look at scholastic achievements, and we can look at language in terms of two different things. We have defined language in a variety of ways. We will not go into the details of how we define language, but I would definitely want you to keep in mind the distinction between performance and competence. I definitely want you to keep in mind the distinction between language as a system and the use of language, and language as an entity as a faculty of mind and language as a social reality. These distinctions are going to help us a lot. Also, that lot includes what helps us bridge the distinction between these two aspects of language. Coming back, we want to look at language in the context of scholastic achievements from two different perspectives. The abbreviations used for this is given in the picture. It is BICS, which stands for Basic Interpersonal Communication Skills, and CALP, which stands for Cognitively Academic Language Proficiency. Now, we want to look at these things, but please understand what follows from these two terms right away. Please pay attention to the word basic, and in the second term please pay attention to the word academic. What these two represents have been discussed by Bernstein as two different terms what we discussed last time, restricted code and elaborated code. What seems to be basic and the types of language used for interpersonal communication skills, Bernstein termed it as restricted code, and what is termed as cognitive and academic language was termed as elaborated code in Bernstein's terminology. We have seen the distinction between the two, and I would urge you to apply similar distinction to these two languages, these two types, of course added with what we are going to look at. So, an understanding of these two terms draw our attention to further parts of how we know these things. One is interpersonal communication skills. Please look at interpersonal as well. It simply means the language that we normally speak. In real terms, how we speak. Bear in mind please that when we speak, we do not pay attention to the functioning of language. That is, we do not pay attention to the medium, and it is that basic. We will look at the implications of these two in a moment, but please understand the two terms with the help of these terms. Minimal abstraction. So, the nature of interpersonal communication is that it has very little scope for abstraction. People would want to make things clear and clear to a great extent. There is very low critical analysis. It does not interpersonal, the nature of interpersonal communication will not allow you to get into critical analysis. However, this could be debated, but we want to understand this in the proper adequate context. Low cognitive demand, which simply refers to less attention that we pay to what we speak, and such a thing is heavily context embedded. That is, the context about which things are being discussed are pretty much evident between the speaker and the hearer. On the other hand, so before we go to CALP, we want to summarize this as these are the nature of how people speak. When we go to look at the CALP aspects of language, we want to look at it as it is an advanced format. It is formal. It has a space for abstraction and specialization. That is, the use of abstract ideas and the use of language for abstraction and use of specialized terms and the use of language for understanding specializations, these are the contexts in which when we use language, such a language is referred to as cognitively academic language proficiency. It has presumably high cognitive demand, that is, it requires attention, and it is argued as being context reduced. That is, the context, it is easy to lose the context in the situations where we use academic language. And naturally, it's these features establish the distinction between two things: language used in interpersonal communications and language used for academic purposes, that is, the use of academic language. We might find this distinction in general discussions as well. Lot of times you will find people saying, I do not use academic language, or referring to someone, his style or his speech is too academic, or her speech is too academic. The distinction they want to make, and the point that they are bringing in, that the use of interpersonal communication, the use of language in interpersonal communication, and the use, even if you want to use it, use language for formal environments, informal contexts, the best way is to use the styles and the way you would use in interpersonal communications, making language academic language, and to sound like using academic language is simply not really looked down upon, but what people mean with this is we lose many a times what the person wants to say, what the person wants to refer to. That is why it is called context reduced. So, from the very generic understanding of layman's language and academic language, it is pretty clear that layman's language is more valued language for variety of things, and academic language may have its own advantage. However, that is not a preferred variety. Now, we would want to understand this in the context of education. The simple point is, the language of education must be BICS, that is, the way we normally speak. The language of interpersonal communication must be the language of the classroom as well. That, in other words, we should speak, we should use the language in classroom the way we would use it anywhere else. That has got more power of communication, that transacts the ideas, even complex ideas, in a very simple way. Having said that, what will really help use the language of interpersonal communication in classroom is the language of the participants of the classroom. The way the participants of the classroom use the language in their real life, which is outside the classroom. So, the language of the participants of the classroom outside the classroom, when that becomes the language of the classroom, it is argued that it will result in better consequences. It will help participants understand whatever is expected from them to understand with more effectiveness. I hope that this is evidently clear, whereas the use of the language which is academic language, which is cognitively loaded, totally context reduced, are going to be difficult, is difficult to sustain for a long time, and then it is not going to be very helpful for the classroom. In that context, the idea of multilinguality comes into picture. For such a situation, multilinguality must be the norm in the classroom, because that is what is the nature of language. So, we cannot reduce multilinguality from the classroom. Where the question is not whether or not we should use multilinguality as the medium of education. The point is, language is multilinguality to begin with. The only effort that has to be put in, that there should not be an effort to reduce that to a language, and even within a language it will work in a more serious sense if it is not, if the efforts are not put for reducing it to the features of academic language. Therefore, if we are not making the language in the classroom academic language, this sounds little contradictory, but it has to be understood in the context that if we do not try to make the language of the classroom academic language, then the effect is exponential. We would like to understand two typical cases that were related to language, and they were actual courtroom cases. One was in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is famously known as King versus Board of Education, and the other was in Oakland, California. They were approximately 20 years apart from one another. However, the main idea was the same. African American community of United States felt discriminated in the domain of education. So, both the cases were related to African American language and the issues of education embedded with that. And the main point of both the case again was that the community felt that the teachers negatively evaluated students' academic abilities and potential because they spoke a language which was not considered to be standard language. And here I want to use the term standard with emphasis. The African American language had all kinds of names for it. One of the most respectable name was vernacular. It was around the time when people were still making effort to understand the significance and the role of vernacular in our lives, where we have come to a conclusion that it is vernacular that is the language, that is what people speak, and the effect of vernacular for understanding anything in the classroom is going to be remarkable. So, this is where these two cases were located, that there was a clear feeling in the society that teachers negatively evaluate academic abilities and potential of students because they speak vernacular. These cases were located in Ann Arbor, Michigan and Oakland, California. However, this is the situation of every single classroom in any parts of the world. In particular, this is the situation in every single classroom in the context of India, where there may not be a conscious discrimination against a given language in the classroom. However, the consequence is exactly similar. In order to overly emphasize the use of a language, it could be English or Hindi or Bengali or Tamil or anything for that matter, the effect is exactly the same. This requires a little bit more elaboration, and therefore, again I suggest you to read Deficit Hypothesis of Bernstein and variability hypothesis and other related seminal writings by William Lebov in understanding variation within language and beyond language. So, the outcomes of these two cases were that in 1997, as late as 1997, the Linguistic Society of America passed a resolution supporting the resolution of Oakland School Board. And the resolution pointed out that African American language was not slang. It was not a sloppy use of language. It was not an example of sloppy use of language or incorrect. And the Linguistic Society of America asserted the significance of the society in terms of the use of vernacular language. And then on the basis of serious findings and research, it was established that the use of vernacular has almost nothing to do with academic. The use of vernacular has nothing to do with the academic performance. In fact, what it has to do is with academic performance or scholastic achievement is just the other way around. The higher the level of multilinguality, higher the use of vernacular language in the classroom, higher the use of context embedded language, higher academic achievements, higher scholastic achievements and academic performance. And the further consequences are even better because such a language, such use of language in classroom and elsewhere results into greater social tolerance, and that also results into higher cognitive flexibility of the speakers. So, higher the degree of multilinguality, larger the degree of cognitive flexibility. Such is the significance established for the use of language in the classroom. Now, please look at and try to evaluate that anything but this, and in particular an attempt to reduce the use of language in the classroom to a language will have negative impact on it, and that is what was found or established in the court of law in these two cases, which in a way changed to a large extent American education policy. Such a change is optimally required at least at the level of understanding for the language planners and educators and educationists. That is one of the most relevant findings of the study of language, which is also known as linguistics, and that is one of the most significant contribution of linguistics in education, in understanding education and in substantiating the use of language in the domain of education. Such controversies over language in education simply points out to the complex relationship between, please look at these terms, heavily loaded and powerful terms: language, education, national and cultural politics. In the domain of education, culture and politics, and the complex that it creates, the use of language is a very significant aspect to look at. The language that are spoken in schools, the language that are taught, and the use of language for learning and instruction are all more than simple matters for pedagogical effectiveness. The question of pedagogical effectiveness lie in the use of vernacular, lie in the use of context embedded language, lie in the use of multilinguality, and above all not making an effort to reduce the use of language to a language. The definition in the use of language and the language education in schools are part of broader cultural political debates about how nation will be defined and about the structure of power relationship among various ethnic, racial, economic and linguistic groups. All these are nice things, but the significant point to conclude, and this also has a bearing on what we have discussed yesterday, that all kinds of research and empirical evidence in society points out just one thing, that language can only be defined as multilinguality. Therefore, any attempt to reduce the use of language in any other way is only going to have consequences. We need to do nothing. In fact, we need to do we only need to maintain the point that we do not more than, we do not put an effort, we do not make an effort in reducing the use of language to a language. That will take care of most of these things. That will take care of the issues of language use in education, and that helps us understand how social cognition and cognition have an impact on us understanding the domain of education and therefore society vis-a-vis language. Thank you.